Bueno, y gracias por venir. Estamos aquí, Sadie Smith y yo, y vamos a hacer esta charla en inglés. Creo que todos ustedes tienen traducción simultánea, pues los que lo necesiten tienen traducción simultánea. Aunque el castellano sigue siendo nuestra lengua por ahora en América Latina, para la comunicación entre ella y yo y para que fluyera mejor la entrevista, pensé que sería mejor hacerlo en inglés. Ella está entendiendo todo lo que yo estoy diciendo de todas maneras porque sabe italiano y entiende el castellano. So, you know Sadie Smith, she's the author of a number of novels. The first one of them is White Teeth, which made her famous all over the world. And then she wrote other novels like On Beauty and W, The Autograph Man, and most recently Swing Time, which is the novel that we're supposed to be presenting today. It's published in Spanish by Salamandra. She's also written essays for several media, and they are collected in 2 volumes. The first one of them, I don't remember the title of, and the second one is Feel Free. What's the title of the first one?
Changing My Mind.
Changing My Mind, of course, which is a good title too. So we're going to talk about the essays and the novel, and I want to start with the novel. You wrote this long novel, as all the novels you write.
Yeah.
You are a very you're a writer who enjoys writing, or so it seems, and I wanted to talk about that first of all.
Right.
That your relationship to writing, which is not or doesn't seem to be torturous or tormented by choices or silence. I mean,
Right.
I'm sure it is in some measure, but it doesn't seem to be threatening your task at all. So I wanted to talk about your relationship to writing through abundance and dexterity, and how you seem to enjoy it, and how you seem to say so much.
Right.
Because I think you've written about that too, about those literatures of the sparsity and silence, and these other literatures,
Right.
typically English, of covering the world with words.
Right.
And I wanted to talk about that to begin with.
So do you all have earphones translating? Do I just talk now? We good?
Yeah.
Okay. Uh, it's funny that to me I feel completely the opposite. I know I have facility. I think that's what you mean, but I dislike it in myself, you know. So Swing Time is a good example. Like, as it is with every novel I write, I intend to write a perfect 110-page existential novella, and I end up writing a 450-page, heavily populated piece of comic fiction. So it's never what I plan, you know. And I have a great envy for other traditions, but I think one of the truths of being a writer is that you're limited in a certain way by your childhood, by the books that were put in front of you. And I would have been a very different writer if I had grown up in Paris, you know. But I grew up in England, and I read Dickens, and I read Shakespeare, and I read Tolstoy, and everything else that came to me in the way of a more global taste or eclectic taste came later. But it's very hard to be influenced when you're 35, you know. Most of the influence happens when you're 9. And so I was formed by books that, if I could do it again, I wouldn't choose those books, but I can't do it again. So I find writing very difficult in the sense that I have a lot of self-loathing as I write, you know. But I guess what's perhaps unusual is I write through it. Yeah.
Yes. Well, your novel, as I said, covers the world, and it literally does. It takes place in London, and then in Africa, and in New York. And it has mostly like this vitality that has to do with the power to travel and to change places. And it's one thinks of globalization and globality, and when looking at it, but at the same time, it deals with what it means being from somewhere,
Right.
being not localized but local, and having grown up somewhere.
Right.
What do you intend to say about not origin, but the relationship to place, to a place?
Well, while I was writing Swing Time, I was also writing shorter things, and I wrote a short story which is set in the future, you know, way in the future, a kind of speculative fiction thing. And I realized later when I read the short story is that though it seems from a different universe from Swing Time, the thing which is the same is this idea that to be local in the contemporary consciousness is to be disadvantaged, right? Part of the idea of wealth is that you can move freely, that you're not tied to anything. And in Swing Time, there's a kind of global pop star character who is the kind of physical reality of that. She doesn't live anywhere, she doesn't belong to anywhere, and she considers that her glory, really. And in my science fiction story, it was kind of an extreme version where anybody who's left in a place in the story, in this case England, is the disenfranchised. You know, the people left in this modern England are the people who couldn't get away as the water rose and as this kind of collapse occurs. So I recognize that as a new kind of wealth, just as the same as, you know, if you went to the 17th century, to be fat was to be rich. Now, supposedly, to be fat is to be poor. You know, you have to watch these transformations of values. But I guess when I'm writing, I'm trying to resist the idea that these values are reality. You know, they're ideological, and there's a lot to be said for the localized, the rooted, someone who is present in the community, someone who, you know, so much contempt is thrown in the idea of being born, living and dying in the same geographical space. But for thousands of years, that was reality. I was
Still reality
It's
for
still
most
reality
of
for
people.
millions of people. And in my own life, I was born and brought up in a council state in northwest London, and then when I made money, when I was young, I bought a house opposite that council estate, which is a classic example of a localized mind, right? And
The other side of the street.
right, I couldn't imagine anything outside of Willesden. And I can remember being interviewed by journalists at the time, I guess upper middle class journalists, who found it essentially comic what I had done, you know, and I grew to be a bit ashamed of it, but then as I got older, I thought, no, you know, that was my vision of a good life, was that neighborhood, my friends, my family, and the contempt which is poured on that vision of a local life, or a life with limits more than anything, is what interested me.
Yeah, the other question would be, of course, if there are some places more local than others.
Right.
If being from London, no matter what neighborhood in London, is the same as being from some corner in the Andes, if you're
Right.
as much as a Londoner as you can be an Andean peasant from that piece of land, you know? But that's
Well,
another
I
question.
don't think so, because some cities are mythologized. London is one of them. New York, we were just talking backstage, is another one. Even people resident in New York, as I am, frequently feel themselves to be living in a movie. You're not living in a physical space, you're living in layers of ideology and mythology, which can have quite comic effects. You know, quite often when I'm in New York, as we visit each other's apartments, I'm in NYU housing, so I'm rent controlled like various people in the city. But you can go to the apartment of people earning, you know, the kind of 1%, and their apartment is no bigger than the council estate flat I grew up in. So you know people are living in ideology when they're willing to pay amounts of money that are obscene to even repeat on the stage, to live in a box of the same kind that I grew up in. So for me, that kind of those extremities make you wonder about even the rationality of that kind of wealth. You know, there's a deep insanity in those situations.
Definitely. There is also a way in which you belong to a time, and that's also one of the topics of your novel, I think, which is called ironically Swing Time, because the novel doesn't take place at that time that we know as
Right.
Swing Time. But there are a couple of little girls that then grow up, and they live in that time.
Right.
And the way in which they live in that time is they watch dancing. They dance, but for me, the most important part about that activity was watching dancing.
Right.
And so when I was reading the novel, I wondered what makes a time. Like, it's not historical events,
No.
and or not only, or not necessarily the most important feature, but there is an atmosphere that makes a time feel like that time,
Right.
like swing time. And it may be music, of course, but then there are many periods in history from which you don't have any recordings, and then there is dance, and that's what the novel seems to suggest. There is the way people moved at a particular
Right.
time, but I wanted you to talk about the relationship with a period in time that is not your own, but you come from that period of time because you come from all the periods of time that
Right.
were before, and that is not nostalgic necessarily. It's an affinity, but
Right.
yeah.
It's hard. I mean, nostalgia is a very deep temptation for a writer, perhaps particularly for a British writer. Um, what I was trying to get at, and I, I, I realize now as I'm older that maybe this was a strange feeling to have as a child, but I always had the sense that being born in 1975 in the place I was born in represented like unprecedented historical luck. I always had that sense. I would read, I used to read the encyclopedias a lot. This is obviously pre-internet. And I remember very keenly looking at pictures of people being disemboweled in London streets in the 1500s as a punishment, being drawn and quartered, which is when you open up the body, take out the guts, and drag a person, usually by a horse, through the streets. And I remember thinking very clearly, wow, I'm glad it's not 1512. I always had that sensation of luck, of historical luck. And of course it's intensified by your identity, I suppose. Both my parents were from a long line of servants, one way or another. So my father's mother and their family worked in a big house downstairs, and my mother's mother was like an orderly in a hospital. So they came from this long line of, profoundly dispossessed people. So my perspective in our estate was very skewed. I really felt rich. I felt really lucky. It was only when I moved out of my childhood and realized there was a scale of richness that I understood where I stood in British life. But in my childhood, I was under an illusion that we were doing really well. we were really living the dream. Yeah.
And that scale of richness is infinite too.
Right. It's infinite.
Infinitely down and infinitely up it goes, and yeah. And that brings me to the other thing I wanted to talk about with you, which was servitude.
Right.
It seems to me that it's somehow or for some reason very relevant right now. You saw Roma, the film by Cuarón,
Right. Yeah.
and then there is The Favorite, the Yorgos Lanthimos
Right.
latest film, also about serving
Right.
someone else. It's also about two women, one serving the other one,
Right.
actually a triangle of two women serving another one. And in your novel, there's a couple of friends, of female friends,
Right.
that grew up together. And then there is another couple of friends. One of them becomes friends with another woman, but is also her servant, is her personal
Right.
assistant, but that's a name for a servant. And so why do you think it's becoming so relevant as a topic now? Because maybe even more than race and class, now we are thinking in terms of master and servant again.
I think, in my view, it's the return of the repressed. So what happened in the 80s and 90s is we convinced ourselves that we'd come to, I mean in the West, and particularly in Anglo-American culture, that we'd come to the end of history, that we were in a social democracy in which something which had held true for thousands of years, the existence of servitude and of hierarchies of people, had basically disappeared. You know, I mean, I know from living in New York that the servitude, it stopped it being in your house, but it of course is everywhere. There are nannies and tutors and fitness instructors, and there's around each individual woman in New York, there is this invisible army of people working for her. And the relation is supposedly one of equality. Every now and then we have these monstrous um, stories in New York, you know, a nanny murdering children or some other rebellion of a servant class. And everybody is suddenly awakened to the realization, oh, this is a city of servitude. In my own life, when I first had children, I'd go into the playground and realize that as far as everyone was concerned in the playground, I was another Jamaican nanny. All the nannies are Jamaican. And I'm with these children, and I must be another one of this invisible class. And so then you're in a strange position. Are you meant to assert oh, I'm not the servant class, I am the mother in this case, over your sisters, perhaps your cousins, your second cousins. So this kind of invisible servitude, I think, has been deeply repressed. And then, even in practical terms, I wrote a story about an actual slave being kept in a suburban house in Willesden. And that story came from a news article that my mother showed me. I was home, and she said, you know, down the road from us, there was a woman being kept as a slave in this house, with her passport taken from her, with her wages kept. That's a kind of explicit expression of it, but it's also around us all the time. And then I was thinking too, as I wrote Swing Time, of the servitude of one country to another. And the idea, perfectly obvious idea, that we repress all the time, that when you sit down to dinner, when you get dressed, there is an invisible army of people making these clothes, providing this food. In the case of your iPhones, producing the cobalt which is in the phone. Children mine that for a few dollars a month. So the thing that we hold as our great symbol of, I don't know, technocratic futurism and liberation is literal servitude in your pocket. It takes a lot, I believe, to not look at that.
But at the same time, just as we were saying that class and money are this infinite scale, servitude is too, because you are in your turn the servant of that phone and of the company that made the phone and of the kind of world that in which that phone is necessary. And
absolute freedom isn't possible, obviously, between participants, but decent relations are possible.
Exactly. And what would that be? I mean, and we can go back to your novel. It seems like neither of us want to talk about.
No one wants to talk about the novel. No, me least of all.
But let's talk about that relationship between a master and a servant, which are also friends, and are mutually necessary. Because I think it's very interesting, and they are women, both of them, because it's very different from the female friendship that you find in Elena Ferrante, for example. Did you think about that, her saga, when you wrote it?
I loved Ferrante, and I was absolutely inspired by it, but in a slightly melancholy way, in the sense that what struck me in Ferrante was the friendship. In my life, I suppose I never really had. I don't have sisters, and I grew up somewhat isolated as a child. So the idea of that friendship interested me, and I guess in my novels it's slightly different from Ferrante. It really is one person split in two.
Exactly, it's more.
It isn't really about friendship in the way that Ferrante is. It's about there, but for the grace of God. I'm always wondering about the possibility of another life, you know. And I suppose my subconscious is structured that way. What if I hadn't been lucky? What if this hadn't happened? What if that hadn't happened? But I think that's to do with the kind of British meritocracy I grew up in, which I was, you know, when I was a kid, because I was benefiting from it, I was blind to it. I thought it was a wonderful thing that Britain had decided to lift me and maybe 2 other kids from this huge school and send us to university. I was grateful on my knees, you know, free education, free healthcare, I had to grow up to realize that taking 3 children from a school of 3,000 and calling it a meritocratic society is a crime. All those children in my school had ability, talent, they had power, they had something that was worth exploiting. But the channel was so narrow, and now it's almost extinguished.
But listening to you, I was wondering if there is another way to think about it. Not so much, I am so lucky because I was born, I don't know, in this century and in London or even in Colombia. I mean, not so lucky as you, but lucky still. but but I need a certain social class or um, but then there is this way of thinking about it, which is, no, I'm not lucky. I'm unlucky because not everybody has the same
Right.
privileges. It's not like they are not lucky and I am lucky, but I am
Right.
not either, because this world is, the whole of it is my
Right.
world, and my experience is that of poverty and deprivation too.
Right. And it should not be reliant on this kind of luck. What's interesting to me now, dealing with younger people when I teach, is that some of the basic principles I grew up uh, believing in and benefiting from, for example, the idea that education is a basic right, not a question of luck, that healthcare is a basic right, not a question of luck, is hard to convey even to young people who consider themselves liberal, particularly in America, who really feel fundamentally inside them that the fact that their parents have money represents some kind of example of love. They were thoughtful enough to have money. They loved me so much, they paid for this education. It's so deep in American consciousness, and it's so far from the way I was raised, Yeah.
Yeah. I want us to talk about realism, to move from
Right.
your novel to your essays,
Yes.
but I want to establish that link, and also that affiliation maybe of yours. You're definitely a realistic novelist, no matter what realism, but it's not experimental, and
Right.
it's definitely these novels, you said it yourself, heavily peopled.
Right.
So there are these novels full of people,
Right.
and we're going to talk about what these people are later, but also full of things,
Right.
full of objects and brands and specifics and concreteness. And one thinks of reality as, or of that reality that you both convey and represent and create,
Right.
as what philosophy has called the regime of the visible.
Right.
And then you say in one of your essays, you say, that's what I try to concern myself with in fiction, the way of things in reality, as far as I am able to see and interpret
But
them.
that's very key, that second part, because that
Yeah.
disavows some kind of positivist thing. I'm talking about subjectivity.
Yes.
I am trying to convey the world through a particular subjectivity. But yes, go on.
No, that was it. I
Right.
wanted you to what you're doing, so go ahead.
That part's important to me. That it the reality, as far as it's conveyed, is completely bounded and contained by a consciousness, and therefore, not to be trusted at a profound level. But I also, I can't deny the title of realist. But I just finished a book of short stories, and I was very aware in those stories that I'm not that writer, And part of it is to do with form. In that shorter space, I had so much more freedom, I felt, to play. And so there are very few stories in that collection that are full of people and things. They're full of ideas and gaps and silences, and it precisely experiment. What's hard to do, and I admire anyone who can do it, is to extend that kind of playfulness in a novel. It is hard. And I absolutely do, and I'm scared to say this in Colombia, but I have I can't, magic realism as a form is very hard for me. I do find that hard. I was reading a collection of stories by a writer recently, in which every element is fantastical. Birds come from mouths. The floor opens up. To me, when everything is fungible and changeable, it's hard to know what matters. in a world of nothing but fantasy. I love science fiction and I love fantasy, but that's again the rule-playing part of me. And
That's
I can't
also,
help it.
don't try to, because magical realism doesn't come out well while tried by anyone else.
No.
That
Right. There are some
because no,
geniuses in the
but
form, but
this was kind of a joke, but it's not, because it's not a form.
right.
And it was, well, this is the way I think about it. It was adopted by some American writers and also writers in the
Yes.
subcontinent as a form.
Right,
And it
it's a
wasn't at
problem.
all. It was mythology. It was a way of thinking, not reality. It was not realism at all,
Right.
but of studying reality and of thinking about thought and truth and the human being.
But
It was not
again,
about people
it's
flying.
so there's a good thing David Foster Wallace says about forms in that sense, that there will always be, like Marquez, something genuinely new, and then behind it comes what David called the crank turners, people who just start turning
Yes,
a crank.
completely turning a
And
crank.
and that can happen in any form. It certainly happens in what's called literary realism as well. I think what excited me in writing the stories is that every single time I was asking myself, what can I do in this story that is new? Like that's, I think it's Kundera says that's the only moral responsibility of fiction is the new. And as been my experience of a novel, no matter how creative you think you are, or however original, you're using a very tired, shop-worn form. And exhaustion sets in, and before you know it, you're writing about somebody rummaging in their pocket, or somebody, even when as they walk across the room, you're using forms from television, you're using forms from other novels. Plot itself is usually, turning of the first order. But I don't. I'm not. I have plenty of purist, experimentalist writer friends, and I'm not a purist. I believe in the mixed nature of the novel, and I know I can read a novel by someone, and there will be the element of crank turning, and there'll be the element of the familiar and secondhand, but there will also be something genuinely new, and I'll take it. I don't need perfection, and I think what happens often with writers who are dedicated to the principle of experiment, that their self-loathing about the second hand is so strong, the novel becomes anemic. All that can be said is what's never been said before, and since there's so little of that, the novel is very small and very almost scared to speak. And I would rather be, shaggy and wrong, and in order to get something fresh.
Well, you say in that same essay, which is the essay, I think, on. No, it's not in the same essay. It's in another one in which you write about J.G. Ballard. And I think that's a very fine. I think that's a very fine piece that you wrote. And I want to quote you, quoting Ballard. He says, "We live in a world ruled by fictions of every kind. We live inside an enormous novel. The fiction is already there. The writer's task is to invent reality."
Right.
So I wanted us to talk a little bit more about basically what is reality. What's reality? According to Ballard and according to you, if I say that you're a realistic novelist and you understand what I mean,
But the
what
problem with
is it that
being,
we're talking
I think of being a realist novelist as an accusation, because realism is about the recreation of ideology. The supposedly real world we live in is an ideological construction. So the realist novel is someone who is reproducing ideology unthinkingly. I hope I'm not doing that. But
No, let's think about it as something in which the visible world can be
Right.
recognized, and the laws of the laws and the rule and the
I think,
basic laws of the visible world are.
well, here's one thing. There's a line of Roth, and he's so different from Ballard, but it's a similar principle. He says, fiction readers go to fiction go to fiction to be rid of everything that isn't fiction, meaning the world itself is fiction. You go to fiction for something else. He's a funny writer. My middle brother is a writer and a comedian, a stand-up. And when I think of that kind of comedy, the awful phrase is truth to power, but comedy tells the truth in a way that is usually painful for people to hear it, painful to accept. I love comedy for that reason, and I love comic writers for that reason. So that is one way that you can pierce through this common sense world. You know,
I agree.
even the simplest stand-up usually does more in 20 minutes than most novelists do in a fucking lifetime, to be honest, in terms of truth telling. And the great comedians, people like Richard Pryor, I mean, I would give the oeuvres of many novelists for an hour of Richard Pryor. So there's an incredible power there. But someone like Ballard is this is an atypical example. The genius on display in Ballard it doesn't come along very often. You know, I wrote that essay in full humility, and one of the most beautiful things about Ballard, from my opinion, is that he never, like a lot of young writers, feel that to be an experimental writer, a daring writer, one must live a particular kind of life. Ballard lived in the suburbs. He was a widower. He raised 3 children. If you looked at him, you would think perhaps he was a driving instructor. But he went into his study every day and wrote some of the most shocking, challenging, uh, wildly formally exciting books that have ever been written in England. And to me, he's an example of what real freedom in prose looks like. It's here.
Yep.
It doesn't matter about your kitchen and the car outside or the children in the bedrooms. It has to happen here.
Then you also say, I mean, we are still on realism and
Yeah.
on the character of the realistic novel. I wanted you to talk about that because I wonder what that character is. You say at some point in which you talk about N.W., your novel, I really wanted to create people in language. And I was reading that sentence and I wondered what it meant. I mean, what's the status of those people created in language?
Oh,
Because
sorry.
you also say that it's impossible
It's impossible.
to do that.
Right.
But then you also say that you make those people, and you actually do. I mean, these are heavily peopled novels. So I wanted to talk about character and personhood. What's the relationship between a character and a person? In what way a character is or is not a person, or is it part of everybody? Or
You know, they're made out of sentences, obviously, and they're not real in a formal sense, but there is a feeling of vitality and life that comes off, you know, some of the people in Chimamanda's work, for example, some in Roth, some in Nabokov, certainly in Tolstoy. Madame Bovary seems to me a human. But it's, in a certain way, philosophically, it's indefensible. You know, it's like a silly magic trick that you're doing. It's childish at a certain level. But for me, it's not one project. Different novels ask for different things. For instance, with On Beauty, the only thing I wanted to do was to put Black people like me, that I recognize in a Victorian novel. That is explicitly the purpose of On Beauty. And it's a childish thing, maybe. It's the kind of thing when I was 14, when I picked up Middlemarch and thought, I love Middlemarch, but wouldn't it be amazing if one of these people had an afro? That would be amazing. When I became whatever I was when I wrote On Beauty, 28 or 9, that I wanted to do it. It's a childhood thing. And I think with most writers, you will see this compulsion from childhood. And you may or may not like the compulsion from childhood, but it always happens. You know, if a writer was obsessed with comic books, sooner or later they're going to write a novel about comic books or tap dancing or whatever it is. And so with On Beauty, I felt that even though all around me there were more formally interesting things going on, I was writing to kids like me because that book would have meant something to me. It would have meant something to me. And it's easily, you know, in formalist circles, something like that is considered extra literary and not interesting. But it's usually white people saying it, and who have had a natural identification with their characters for 1,000 years, and so it doesn't occur to them that this might be important because they consider their selfhood basically invisible. Madame Bovary is me, you know, they're all me. They think that they're identifying in this enormous, you know, empathetic Shakespearean way, But it might be that they're just narrowly identifying racially and socially with people who kind of look like them and come from their world. So for me, On Beauty was about reproducing that literary enjoyment of identification for people like me.
No, I think that idea of the novel as fantasizing with people in places is perfectly good, and
Right.
and there's a lot to be there
Right.
could be a lot to be said about that, about what it means to put people in places,
Right.
because that's actually revolutionary if you think about it.
Right.
It's about putting other people in places they haven't been, so it's interesting. Okay, I wanted to talk about, now we don't have much time, but I have 3 things I wanted to mention, and one is citizenship.
Yeah.
The relationship between citizenship and characterization.
Right.
For democracy, we are also characters, not people. Characters who make a decision, make decisions, make one decision.
Right.
And you have this essay, this essay on Brexit. I should have it here. Well, where you talk about how democracy has this thing of taking big issues and making them go through a very narrow door.
Right.
And I think that you can relate that to what the novel of the 18th and 19th centuries have done. I mean, we will call it the realistic novel,
Right.
not implying that yours is, because there's also this component of humor, which we won't have time to talk about. But I think there is this relationship between creating people in books,
Right.
this empire of fiction, of realistic fiction, which means fiction that you can believe can be true, could be true, and this claim of democracy, of
Right.
being able to speak with many voices, and
Right.
and having those voices be the voices of people instead of characters. I think we are characters for democracy. Would you?
The key thing I think I'm trying to encourage in my students is not to give capitalism its ultimate victory. And its ultimate victory is believe yourself to be an individual who owns his self identity the same way you own a car or own shoes, and who applies for their rights as an individual to a democracy. That is an error politically, and as far as I'm concerned, it's an error in terms of the idea of a character. I was brought up in my family and in my neighborhood in the idea of the people, a coalition of people. Obviously, in my family, in a mixed race family with a white father and a black mother, that's part of coalition is a necessity. But also politically, when we went out marching, we marched collectively. We marched for apartheid, we marched for women's rights, we marched for the miners, though we were in London and had never seen a mine and didn't know what a mine was. We would go as black people, as the anti-racist coalition, to march for the miners. The miners marched for the gay community. In the 80s, we learned the idea of the people.
The people.
We did not learn the idea, this is my struggle, I own it, don't touch it, don't speak on it. You hand capitalism its finest victory. If you say on the shop floor, I am a black woman, this white worker has nothing to do with me, don't talk about my struggle, I won't talk about yours, what a triumph for the boss man. Because he doesn't have to worry about you unionizing. To me, that is a profound error. And then when that political error is expressed in fiction, in my creative writing classes, and people speak to me of their identity that they must express purely, and that anybody who crosses the line, to talk the language of appropriation is to talk the language of capitalism. It's an error in my view. And whenever I'm having those discussions with young people, I try to remind them that even the word is new. And the whole argument could have been structured otherwise. I could come on this stage and say to you explicitly, I am a voyeur, which is true. I am a voyeur. I love other people's lives. I'm very curious about them. I've written novels in which I am a white man in his 50s, in which I am a Chinese Jewish kid, in which I am an old black American girl, in which I'm I'm not any of these people. Even if and the most absurd argument of appropriation, of course, is if you look at me and think I vaguely look like some of these people, then in your mind it's okay. It's absurd. And it's almost always constructed from the white point of view. So I noticed, particularly in a book like White Teeth, nobody really ever accused me of the appropriation of Bengali lives, because from a white reviewer's point of view, it's all the same. You're brown, they're brown, fine. There's such an implicit racism in the concept. So I try and restructure it as confessing something, which is my profound, irresponsible, and probably immoral curiosity about other people's lives. Wanting to be in them, wanting to know what they're like, what they eat, what they study, what their faith is, what they wear. I want to know all of it. And I'm stuck in my flesh cage, so I can only know my life in life. I understand that. But in fiction, explicitly, the reason I write fiction is so that I don't have to be trapped in my flesh cage. That's the whole point for me. So that's my confession. I'm imagining that I'm not the only one, right? I'm not the only person who sits down to write with this voyeurism.
But then there's the experience with the essay.
Yeah.
And I've read this that you say about fiction and about living your life differently, or imagining what would have happened if, and living through these characters or in these characters. But then you write essays, and you're a wonderful essayist, and you read Montaigne because you mentioned him, and then there is this starting point for Montaigne, which is what do I know?
Right.
He asks himself, and he says that all his essays are just an examination of himself.
Right.
And then there is this conception of self, of the essayist self, which is completely different from the fiction writer's
Right.
self. So,
But Montaigne says two things. He says, "What do I know? Nothing." But he also, quoting Terence, says, "Nothing that is human is alien to me." And to me, that's the more important quote, that he looked into the world and said, nothing, no matter how foreign, no matter how strange, no matter what, race, gender, politics, whatever, nothing is so strange that I can't make an effort to comprehend or be curious.
To comprehend inside himself, not...
I feel like, I'm reading Montaigne right now, I'm always reading him, but I feel like Montaigne had a very loose sense of self. And I think the truth about most writers, which makes them deeply politically inconvenient right now when people's identities are so important, is that most writers don't feel like anybody.
Excellent.
I think that's the definition of being a writer.
And I think that that's precisely your distance from identity and from race, even, from all these topics that...
I think writers are born existentialists for various reasons, usually my mother says, based in childhood trauma. She should know. She studied therapy, and that's her business. But
I thought you were going to say
she's also inflicted plenty of trauma. Yeah. But I think comedians, actors are another part of the breed. Writers have a very loose sense of self. I think that's clear. Not so loose that they are across the border into schizophrenia, but very, very close. And some of the greatest practitioners, somebody like, I always think of Jim Carrey as a good example, it's like watching somebody speak in tongues. Jim Carrey has people moving through him all the time. And the question is, what is it like? But I think it's true of everyone, it's just people don't admit it. If you're sitting in a room alone without your phone, imagine, for hours alone, who are you really? Holding on to this sense of yourself is incredibly hard. I think what the phone does is provide this constant security. I'm me, I'm me, I'm me, I'm me. But it reminds you.
Well, we won't have time to talk about social media, which was something else I wanted to discuss with you, because perhaps that also happens in social media, the opposite to what you're saying. Perhaps what you're saying is, I'm not this person that identify with myself in Instagram, and I'm not this Facebook persona either, and I'm not this character that I play in Twitter. But maybe through social media, we're playing and displaying the same claim of the novel.
I think the bit I find very curious is that For a long time in Western Europe, the whole point of, for instance, white people is that they didn't have any identity. That was the privilege. That you didn't walk around talking about your whiteness, or you didn't have to because it didn't exist. We were black, we were not white. That was a constant question. When I published my book, every single question was related to the fact that I wasn't white.
Yeah.
The privilege precisely was not having an identity. And what's so interesting is what's happening now. My husband, who is white and in America, once turned to me and said, you know, I used to just be myself, and now I'm a white guy, white guy, white guy, white guy. I was like, yes, welcome to having an identity. But the lesson from that is that an identity is a huge pain in the ass. That's what's strange, is that we, as far as I'm concerned, that the movement to identify white privilege and the rest of it is revenge. It's like saying, here is an identity. You like it? Enjoying it? Enjoying talking about it day and night? But then to me, the flip side of that is strange that we would then assume that having an identity, whatever it is the route to freedom. That part, I'm afraid I don't agree with.
Yeah, no.
I am clearly a black woman born in Britain with a Jamaican mother. Of course, these are facts of my life. But philosophically and deeply inside myself, I am an existentialist. I believe you're thrown into the world, and you act and you act and you act and you act. And there is no purpose in saying, I am this person, therefore I will do this and that. I mean, you can say it, but it's not true. The only thing that exists in reality and as a moral consequence is action. So that part I find strange. I love to be in the body I'm in, with the skin I'm in, and with the hair I have. I love it as I enjoy food and I enjoy every accessory of my life. But identity as a reality, as the essential part of what you are, no, I don't believe it.
I find it interesting in your essays and in your fiction too that one might say that you replace identity for connection. And
Relation is important.
yes, relation. But then there is a piece in your essays that I like above all the rest, which is in that essay on Notes on Attunement,
Oh, yeah.
in which you talk about how you loathed Joni Mitchell, and then one day you discovered you loved her.
Right.
And we don't have much time. It's kind of a whim of my whim. And I wanted you to talk about that because I think it's so important. It's very specific, but it's at the root of all that we've been talking. So the thing is, well, tell them the anecdote and then we will talk.
It's about having an open sensibility. The reason I hated Joni Mitchell basically was I didn't really listen to what I would have thought as a child as white music. I didn't really listen to it in my house. I never really was involved with it, neither classical music nor white music in the form of Joni Mitchell. And then quite late into my life, I was listening to her. It was on the radio, a voice that I always found unlistenable to. I couldn't stand the way she sang. And it suddenly occurred to me that the way she sang was beautiful. I had like an epiphany about this particular voice. I think, to me, that kind of aesthetic flexibility, it's aesthetic, but it's also ethical. To be as open as possible to the world as an aesthetic object, which it is. I mean, it's everything else besides, but in the end, it's what you see and what you hear and what you feel is important. But it is also utopian, I guess what I'm saying. I'm perfectly aware that in order to get, for instance, political changes for a community, you quite often have to band as a group and say very clearly, we are a group of Jamaican women, gay Jamaican women, we demand these rights. Or we are a group of gay Colombians, we demand these rights. Of course, collectivity of identity in order to demand rights is essential. But my question is, existentially, as individuals, that cannot also be the total truth of our existence. But it's possible to be flexible, to say, here I am standing on a podium, demanding my collective rights under this banner. Just as when you go on a march, for example, you're holding a banner, everyone's holding a banner, you're not all holding the same banner, right? And you might find yourself suddenly standing next to someone shouting something which is not quite what you meant, but okay. That's the reality of our social and political lives. But to take that collectivity into, I'm going to use an old-fashioned word, your soul. And I mean, the only name that identifies a person, as far as I'm concerned, in their totality is their name. I am a Zadie. You are a Caroline. That's what we are. I am a Zadie, and each person in here is that name. We can, of course, exist in collectivities in moments, but it's important to me that this person exists too.
Yeah, the point for me in that essay was the the way in which you stated that someone can change completely. Like
Yes.
you didn't recognize when you discovered that you like Joni Mitchell, you the person that you had been
Right.
and who had loathed Joni Mitchell was a stranger to yourself. And you didn't recognize,
Right.
you asked yourself in that essay, who was that girl who loathed, who
And
hated
it's all
Joni Mitchell?
opportunity. Those kind of
And I like
changes are
that so much,
opportunities.
yeah.
What we're
And
dealing with our present identities is their incredible consistency. People are being asked to be consistent as
yeah,
humans over great swathes of time. People are searching through other people's social media feeds to find the time 4 years ago where you said something that's not consistent with what you said now. This vision of what a person is, I don't recognize. To me, a person is a constantly changing thing and is not, the consistency is not necessary to be authentic. Maybe even the concept of authenticity doesn't mean much to me, you know? I always say to my students to make them feel comfortable, I'm a completely inauthentic person. So feel free.
yeah,
Don't worry about it. I'm a phony, total fraud, top to bottom. So you just do whatever you need to do. Let's not get into an authenticity battle. I'm not the right kind of anything. I'm okay with it, so feel free.
well, we should be finishing now. I think we have time for maybe one question or two.
Yeah. I don't know if we'll hear you, though. You have to scream.
Anyone? Questions? ¿Alguien quiere hacer una pregunta? Es que no estoy viendo. Ok, ya
Oh,
me
there you
estás.
go.
Ok.
Gracias. I'm just interested in what you've talked about with cultural appropriation, and I think it's something I don't hear very often, kind of a flaw of liberals, is that if you are this ethnicity, you have to write about this ethnicity or this race, and you can't really branch out. And I'm wondering how that factored into your writing and with a lot of criticism. So for example, if someone said, oh, your Bengali character, that's not accurate, and how you kind of dealt with that.
The problem with that argument is it's assuming the possibility of total knowledge of humans. So if somebody says to me, you know, a black girl would never say that, I'm like, really? How can you possibly know? Have you asked all the black girls? Is there a mass agreement about what we say and what we don't say and how we say it? Obviously, in fiction, there's always the risk of likelihood. That's the risk of fiction. And certainly with White Teeth, there's all kinds of mistakes, I'm sure, cultural mistakes. But I had a choice. I can either write novels about middle-aged, mixed-race girl from Willesden forever, just her and nobody else, or I can take a chance. The chance of wrongness to me is not deadly. It's not deadly. It's okay. If I make a mistake here or there, it's okay. And the question of the mistake is interesting. Like it's assuming, for instance, like when I've written a lot of characters of faith, Muslims, some Jewish people, Catholics, all kinds of different faiths. To say that you would make an error with a character is to suggest, I think as sometimes young writers think, that if you're writing, for instance, a Muslim character, that every young Muslim walks around with the whole of the Quran in their head, for example. This is not the way people are. We're so various that this policing of correctness, it would be hard to see philosophically how that could be true. You could say this is not, I'm this person and it's not like me, but there's a lot of people in the world. And that kind of freedom and risk in fiction is necessary. And also, there have been cases, I think of something like Madame Bovary or Anna Karenina. Women, for generations, have felt incredibly close to these two women, fake, pretend women invented by men. literally 400-page drag performances. But they mean something to me. It makes people feel uncomfortable because that's not what we do in life. We don't do it in our political lives. We don't do it in our social lives. But this is not your real life. This is the place of fiction. It's uncomfortable. It's strange. It's perverse. It doesn't make any sense that a Frenchman writes inside the body of a woman so convincingly that women around the world say, Madame Bovary, c'est moi. That's crazy, but it's what happens, what's possible in fiction. So that's it. There's no defense for it. It's irresponsible. Fiction is fundamentally irresponsible.
Parece que tenemos tiempo para otra pregunta. Si alguien tiene muchas ganas de hacer una pregunta. Sí.
Hello.
Oh, hey.
Hi.
Where are you?
Right here with my baby.
Oh, hey. Oh, your baby.
It's a little Zadie.
Oh, so cute.
Thank you so much for your candor and diving so much into identity. I'm curious to know if how much you really draw from, even though you say fiction is, fundamentally irresponsible, and you don't really see those barriers to what you dive into when you start writing. How much do you really draw from your identity as a Black Londoner raised by a Black mom? Because I feel like many times you can kind of tell, when you look at mixed race kids, you can tell who the nurturer was.
Oh, yeah.
Well,
I did have two, but my father died, so that's not his fault. I mean, so.
But I'm curious to know if some of that is rooted in growing up closer to Blackness versus if the father is the person of color, then there's this disconnect from. Do you agree with that, or do you see that, or
I think it depends. Like, I have two brothers, right? Two Black men brought up by a white father. Yeah. So they would answer differently, and also it's changeable. Maybe from American perspective, it's not clear, but my parents were working class, and that was their unity as far as they were concerned. Class is important in England, and we were from the same place. They had different histories, but they were both, in some ways, histories of servitude going back a long way. So both my parents were nurturers, but my father's been dead a long time, and my mother is going strong. And of course, every writer has this autobiographical source, and that's a central part of it. Like, I'm curious about all kinds of things, but would I be as interested in Jamaica if I wasn't Jamaican? Probably not, right? I have a natural curiosity, and I see a Jamaican novel in my future, and you can't. Those are things that you're attached to. They're your roots. But I feel my roots, but I feel curiosity all over the place, And I also think that people, even the people who live in your house, are profoundly strange to you. I think it's really hard to know people. I mean, you can look like them, you can be from the same place, you can speak the same language, but you don't know them entirely, I'm constantly discovering my mother. I'm sure she's constantly discovering me. But that sentimental feeling of history, which is really what Swing Time is about. When I was in West Africa, the whole book came out of seeing a group of women dancing. I was dancing with them. And as we were dancing, it was impossible to avoid the idea that we were related, that the dance was related, the same dance I've done in Jamaica, it's the same dance I've done in New York. I was in, absolutely in the bush, in the Gambia, far from electricity, far from televisions, and yet we were all dancing a dance we seem to know instinctively. It's almost impossible to repress the sentimental idea of connection. At the same time, how is it possibly true? We grew up a million miles apart in completely different cultures and completely different conditions. So that border interests me, the bit which seems impossible and the bit which feels true.
Bueno, gracias. Buenas noches.
Buenas noches. Gracias.